Okay. Yeah. So what you see on the screen right now is actually very interesting graphic. This was an artistic impression of a city of the future, and this was drawn, to be exact, 107 years back. In 1913. So if you can actually look at the drawing, I mean, if you can zoom it in, or if you're watching it on a computer screen, you can probably see it very clearly. That it's a very interesting drawing, because then if you look at the architecture is very early to early 1900s, right? It's very early 1900s. The way the skyscrapers are imagined, the way the bridges are kind of imagined, where you have the pedestrian bridges which have iron and steel kind of a truss design. But what's uh, interesting about this drawing is that even in 1913 there was a sense of segregation of traffic. So if you look at the drawing, you would find that the trains are lying in an underground tunnel system, on top of which you have a road where you have all sorts of vehicles. So you see the cars, which are, you know, very contemporary to that era. But then, even though this was an impression of a multi-level transit city of the future, and then you would have pedestrians who are at a different level. So there are pedestrian plazas. The building starts at a different level, and there are pedestrian bridges that kind of connect all these things. And this was not the concept of how cities were designed 100 years back, because 100 years back on the road you would have trains, you would have carriageways, driven by horses. You would have people walking around. I mean, pretty much how it is in an unplanned city in India even now as well. So this was 1913, and this, what you see on the screen, is 2013. So this is Bangkok. And so around 100 years, and then the design of cities have kind of evolved and changed. So you have cars on the road, you have pedestrian walkways which are segregated on one side. Then you have the metro rail system, or the light rail transit system, which kind of lies at a different level. So in a way, our cities have evolved quite a lot, but then the concepts haven't come in, you know, very late. I mean, concepts have always been evolving over time. So we'll quickly look at the urban paradigms through time. How has the city evolved over time? But then when we talk of cities and landscape design as a profession, it's important to understand that we need to go way beyond in time. We need to look before the time when cities were even there. So in a nutshell, this is how one would kind of look at the milestones. So at first there was the beginning of the civilization. Then we have the idea of a city design or urban design that kind of comes in. And then after a very long time, you have the industrial revolution. And then you have the beginning of the profession called landscape architecture. So it was essentially an army man in the US, who kind of came up with this concept, or the term landscape architecture. So before that, there was no profession called landscape architecture. So there were designers who would design buildings, there were designers who would design gardens, there were designers who would design cities. So and they would even be inventors in some ways. So this is like the Renaissance time. So the profession comes into being. And then at the turn of the last century, so when I say last century, I mean the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, cities undergo a major transformation, and there are a lot of theoretical constructs that come into being. So I'm not sure if you've studied this in theory of design or in history of architecture, if you have a subject like history of architecture. That the turn of the 19th to the 20th century was a time when a lot of design concepts, a lot of design theories were kind of proposed, and many of them have left a lasting impression in how cities are designed even now. And then towards the 1960s, we have a visionary landscape architect whose name is Ian McHugh, who came up with a method in which one could actually design scientifically. One could design keeping in mind the land, keeping in mind the bioclimatic condition of a place. And that kind of changed the way landscape architecture was viewed at. So in the earlier days, it was more of an aesthetic construct. It was more like a foreground or a background to a building that was there. That was what landscapes were about. But now we have, a scientific reason as to why do we even indulge in doing landscape design. It's in a way very similar to how you would design a building which is functional, design a building that is environmentally sustainable or environmentally responsive, and also a building that's good to look at and happy to live in, right? So the principles are very same. I mean, they are kind of similar for landscape architecture as well, but then the scales are different. You kind of look at that's something that we discussed in the last class. Okay, so even before we get into the beginning of the civilization, it's important to know that the Earth is 4.8 billion years old. We humans are 2 lakh years old. So if I can put that in words, it's 480 crore years old is how the Earth is. Okay, and we humans are just 2 lakh years old. So when you look at it as a timeline, you would know that how small our involvement in this Earth has been. And it's only in the last 10,000 years that we've evolved from a cave dwelling, nomadic tribes of people in different parts of the world, highly vulnerable, could be killed off, by an earthquake or, or by a cold frost or even floods, to leading a stable life. So it was only in the last 10,000 years that we've started farming. And farming was a major shift in the way that we humans lived on this earth. And why this last 10,000 years is because the last 10,000 years is known as a geological era, which is known as the Holocene, Holocene. Okay. And Holocene is that era. So you may have heard of Triassic, Jurassic, so different eras, that. So Holocene is that epoch. I mean, it's not even an era, it's actually a smaller part of an era, which is called an epoch. It's an epoch wherein the temperature variations of the world, the global temperatures have only shifted by like a +2 degrees or a -2 degrees. So there have been no ice ages in between. So there have been no, hot periods of time in between. So what that has given is that in the last 10,000 years, it's given us predictability of climate. So we know that every year there would be 4 seasons or 5 seasons, depending on where you are, or 3 seasons, depending on where you are. But you know that every year at this particular point of time, the rains would start coming. Every year at this particular point of time, the temperatures would start dipping and we would have, winters. So once that is predictable, then you know how to adapt your lives to it, right? So then you know when to sow the seeds, how many harvesting seasons would you get, how much of food could you kind of cultivate out. So there was all this information that was available, and that has immensely helped us to become who we are right now, these technological advances from where we were. So but then you should always remember that this false sense of security that we have, that things are fine, everything is robust, and we've kind of conquered nature, that is actually a myth, because we are still at the mercy of nature. But then because of the fact that we feel that we are in control, we feel that we can go beyond it. Okay, so now coming to cities. So from a cave dweller, which is like 10,000 years back, uh, and even later, the first and foremost thing that we humans discovered was fire. Or we didn't discover fire, but we discovered that we could create and we could control fire. That was actually a big step in the way that we kind of evolved. So fires used to happen, and people would fear fires because fires would engulf large swatches of land. They would kill people. They would kind of render an entire area barren. But once we realized that by using friction, like by using friction, if we can actually start sparks and kind of control fire, and we can use it for an advantage, that allowed us to create better weapons. So earlier we had the Stone Age. We had stone weapons which were not very efficient, and then from there we moved to having metallurgy. We kind of discovered metallurgy. We kind of started using much more efficient weapons, and then from there the next large invention was the fact that we could clear forests using these metal weapons, and then we could kind of sow the seeds of those particular plants which we find edible, or which give us more energy than just going on experimenting. And sometimes people die, or sometimes people get severe allergic reactions, because you eat something which you're not supposed to eat. So, and then there was also this, what made us different from all the other species, is the fact that we have a thinking, intelligent brain. So our brain development was far more superior than the others. I mean, that too is again a relative concept, because how does one um, compare the brain of a human with an elephant with that of a blue whale? It's also a relative concept. But then the fact that we could retain information, we were social animals. We never worked in isolation. We always moved together. We could communicate with each other. We could cooperate with one another to actually start building things, kind of doing newer things. That was a great opportunity which the human brain had. And also the fact that we have a thumb, which is which allows us to hold things which many other animals don't have. And naturally uh, it's only in the simian species, in the monkeys and in humans, that we have a thumb, an opposable thumb. So that allows us to do a lot more things with our hands than the other animals could do. We could build, we could grasp things, we could hold a tool, we could aim it at somebody. We could start drawing, we could start sculpting, chiseling. That's all possible because of our morphological quality. But otherwise, if you look at it, we are as vulnerable as any other animal. Even a virus could kill us off, or a slight temperature difference, or even a blast, or a fire, or a flood. I mean, so we are highly vulnerable. So from a cave dweller, people started settling down. They started, taming the nature. They started kind of growing crops. So when you grow crops, what that does is it gives you a surety that, okay, by the end of this month, I would have enough food to feed so many people. So one did not have to kind of go back to a life wherein from morning till evening and through the night, you are constantly on the mission of hunting for food, or kind of trying to protect oneself, because now you know that there is a certain place from where you could get food. So if I fence it off, and if I start settling in there, then there's a sense of security. At least there are times when your mind could be kept away from this constant fear of protecting yourself. And once you do that, you have a bit more time. So then what can you do? And because you're a social being, and you have so many people, then you can actually say that, okay, five of you start farming today, while the other five would keep a watch on our settlement. The other five could go hunting and get us some meat from the forest, while the others could fend for themselves, or they could indulge in creative activities. They could actually start feeding. They could actually start making things. Then there was barter system. So the ones who would you know produce food would give that to someone. In return, he or she would get a piece of cloth, or they would get a bowl, or an instrument, or an instrument that they could play for entertainment. So the idea of entertainment came into being. There was free time. So and also there was division of labor within the society. And slowly by slowly, when the human population started increasing, because there was people weren't getting killed out so fast. So there was also the fact that there was surplus grains, so one could sustain more population. So when the human population started increasing, we started creating what we know now as the beginning of the civilizations. Or we started the system started getting more complex. So there were essentially different civilizations that kind of came into being in different parts of the world. And in all probability, they never spoke to each other, because it wasn't possible for one human life to traverse from one of these to the other. And knowing that things have changed, there was no telecommunication. And so it's a very interesting concept. There are different theories on how this has come into being. Like different human populations in different parts of the world, and all of them, start their own civilizations, but then they are similar in many aspects, in the way they live, the way the division of the societies were, so, and all these cities had something in common, so the citadel, or the place where the rulers would be, the leaders would be, the citadel was always placed at a higher ground, and then the rest of the city was always laid out in a certain manner. And many of these cities, like for example, let's look at Harappa or Mohenjo-daro. Many of these cities actually had a fairly defined system of circulation. So there were roads and there were buildings, there were plots in which there were buildings, and they knew methods in which, water from the nearest river could be tapped in and could be brought into the city. So one could collect the water from there. And also it's said that, in Harappa, there was even a system wherein there was a drainage network in there as well. So a drainage network essentially means that if you use that water in your house for taking a bath, or or if it rains, then the water could then flow into a network and it would go out. So these were the nascent beginnings of urban design, or of architecture, or of landscape design. And then there were these large places wherein they would meet. So that, in Greece and in Rome, they would be called by different places like an agora or a marketplace or a forum, or so there were different names for these spaces. And they also worshipped nature. So they even had these built monuments, which were built for the first time to kind of worship nature. So and the societies kind of evolved over time. So I'm not going into the details of this, but this is just to kind of give you a beginning of how we started living in cities. How we kind of started looking at the pursuit of aesthetics. We started having a fair enough idea of what is beautiful, what isn't, what is formally as a composition, what works well and what doesn't, which kind of spaces invoke fear, and which kind of spaces, invoke a sense of calm. So, so all these ideas were basically engraved into the human brain over time. Yeah, and then, we started playing with scales, we started having a script, we started documenting things, and life went on till like about 200 years back. So even before I speak about this 200-year back incident, it's important to kind of understand the the time when what we call the Columbian Exchange, or what we know as the time when we started exploring. So essentially, the European countries, who were better seafarers, they knew that there was realization that the Earth wasn't flat. So in the past, there was this concept that the Earth was flat. So if one actually sat on a ship and you kind of, you sailed into the horizon, it's quite possible that one would fall out. So that was the fear that people had. So because of which, one wouldn't venture out too far into the sea. And there were also people who ventured out too far into the sea and who never came back. So there was always this fear of not exploring. And then came the age of the exploration, wherein they figured out that the Earth was a globe, and that if one started a voyage from one end, one could actually go all the way out and reach the other place. So there were different voyagers who kind of set out, different countries, different kingdoms, which kind of gave money to the adventurous seafarers, and said, that okay, here is the money. I'm giving you a ship. I'm giving you so many soldiers. I'm giving you food. You go find out new lands for me. So even before that, even before the voyages actually set out, it wasn't that people weren't sailing. So the Arabs were actually trading between the European continent and the Oriental areas. So we have India, we have the Straits of Malacca. All these places from where the Arabs would keep trading. And then we even had Indian, rulers who actually ruled different parts of the Far East. So like Sumatra, and Java and all these islands, Bali. We had Indian rulers who ruled those areas. We had Indian traders who traded, very frequently between Somalia, the Horn of Africa, and India, and even with the Arabian traders. So So it was important for the Europeans to kind of figure out where the spices were coming in, and it's very interesting if you actually read about these. They would all the origins were always kept a secret of where these spices come from. And they would weave these very fantastic stories, mythological stories against all of these. Like for example, this bag of pepper, that has been savaged from a mystical mountain, wherein there are these large beasts that roam around, and so there were all these stories which kind of made these spices exotic, and obviously the prices went up because of that, and also the desirability of having them also went up. Like for example, the trade of tea in Europe was, I mean, China was the only tea growing country in the world, and it was an extremely expensive thing in then England to actually have tea. Only the rich would have a cup of tea. Having a cup of tea was meant to be um, um, a status symbol. And compare it 200 years later, look at it now. I mean, chai is like the cheapest thing that one could have. हम बाहर जाते हैं, हम vada pav खाते हैं, एक cup chai पीते हैं. So I mean that's how things change. Pepper was supposed to be black pepper, was supposed to be an exotic spice. Actually India was conquered because of the European quest for pepper. In as short a word as is possible. Basically pepper was such an expensive spice that it was even called black gold. So it was more expensive than gold at some point of time. And look at it now. We have pepper in all restaurant tables. Along with salt, and it's something that the restaurants don't even charge us for. You can put as much of pepper as we want onto our toast and slice and then have it. So a lot of what we think is expensive and what we think is not expensive is actually a human construct in many ways. Yeah. So there was in the end of the 15th century, and sorry, in the end of the 14th, sorry, the end of the 15th century, we had in 1495 or so, we had Christopher Columbus, setting trade to find India, and he eventually, travels to the west and he finds the continent of America. So that is, and he comes back to Europe with exotic animals, exotic plants, and along with it a lot of diseases, and along with it a lot of pests and invasive plants. And what he did was also they went to these countries and they also gave indigenous tribes a lot of diseases. So that was for the first time, and they also brought in a lot of food items and plants which could be grown. So a lot of food items that we actually consume today are basically an outcome of all these exchanges that we've had in the past. So this is called the Columbian Exchange, and it's important for us to understand this because our lifestyles today, our landscapes today, our cities today are actually an outcome of, in many ways, an outcome of these Columbian exchanges. So from there we come to around 200 years back. So I mean, what I'm saying is, the man-nature relationships have always been changing. So around 200 years back, we discovered, we basically, kind of stumbled into the Industrial Revolution, and that's because we discovered a fantastic and also a dangerous, technology, which is basically the steam engine. Now why is it fantastic? Because earlier, one's ability to move things around, or one's ability to actually transport food from a distance to your city, basically meant dependent on horses or humans. But now with steam engine, you could actually traverse a much larger distance, and you could actually carry a lot of items from a much further away distance in a shorter time, which meant that I could own farms way away, and I could still get food which is fresh from those farms into the city without it going bad. So that would basically mean that I have much more raw materials. So when I have a lot of raw materials, what would I do? I would rather produce more goods, or I would rather use it. I would rather monetize it. And if I have to produce more goods, I would need more people. So what we saw was basically, and then also steam engine basically meant one could work machines. So you did not really require human labor, but you could use machines to make things much faster. So, and then there were all these colonies which were already, there. So raw materials could start coming in from the colonies, one could process them, and one could sell them into the new market. So it became a new capitalist economy. So now, what happened during the Industrial Revolution was that cities actually started becoming, areas of opportunities. So the farmers, who wouldn't want to toil in the villages would actually migrate into the cities. So the migration that we see today, even in India, all of this essentially starts to the industrial revolution. These problems are not new, of people living in squalor, in slums. This was actually a part of, this actually started with the industrial revolution. This whole idea of class differences in terms of economy, class differences in terms of opportunities. This mass migration of people from the rural hinterlands into the cities. So along with this also came a gamut of diseases. So cities started becoming, places where plague or cholera or all these pandemics would, there would be these outbreaks of these cities. And you would be surprised to know that, how much have these pandemics actually shaped our cities. So cities have, as a response to, kind of prevent a pandemic, or as a response to kind of control a pandemic, we've done so many things. So even in our architecture, the concept of having a toilet, the concept of having a basin, a wash basin, the concept of having a sewage system, a lot of it came in from our responses to preventing pandemics. And even this whole idea of the waterfront of Thames, River Thames, in England, in London. So a concept that we blindly copy in our cities. Ahmedabad has a waterfront which is, like walls on both sides and completely concrete. So the inspiration for it essentially comes from River Thames. So around 100 years back, you know, Thames was a river whose water quality was probably as bad as that of what Mithi River is today. It was so bad that, there are accounts which say that in the House of Commons, in their parliament, they had to actually dip bed sheets in disinfectant, and then they had to hang it around the corridor because the stench that was coming from the river was so bad that, they couldn't have a meeting in there. So from there to what the river is today, and what used to happen then was that, the whole sewage of the city used to just get pumped into the river. So what they did was they did an embankment to the river, and that embankment basically also wasn't a sewage interceptor. So all the sewage from the city would then go into the embankment, into the sewage interceptor, which was actually below the embankment, and they created a landscape urban plaza on top, like a walkway on the top. And that sewage interceptor essentially took care of the sewage, and that was then treated and then released into the river. So, and within a matter of a few decades, the water became so much better, and there was an urban edge to the city. So what are we doing? We are essentially copying the same, but without really understanding the logics. So, and Indian rivers should ideally not be embanked. So, and our technology, our understanding of nature has come way beyond than what we were. We are no more innocent or naive like the way we were then in our understanding of nature. So today we know that, floodplains are important. Flooding is something that we can't prevent. Flooding is something we have to live with. So in that understanding, it's not a good idea to actually have embankments anymore. And also the fact that Indian cities have a phenomenon which European cities do not have. Can anybody tell me what is it? We have a weather phenomenon that we experience which Europe doesn't. Hey, you guys are there with me, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So can anybody tell me what is that climatic phenomenon which is so unique to India that it's actually even named, from an Arabic word, but then it essentially refers to weather or climate.
Monsoon.
The monsoon. Absolutely right. Yeah. So we have the monsoon. So in Europe, it rains. The water levels of the rivers swell up, go down, but then it's all kind of controlled. But in India, we have something which is known as a monsoons, which basically means that in one year we have an extremely dry season, and then we have a torrentially rainy season. Wherein floods are a part of our lives. So ideally, so if you look at our traditionally the way our cities were designed, we would be closer to a river, but never so close that the flood waters actually affect us. And our harvesting seasons would be designed in a way wherein to take advantage of the floods. So, like for example, there are places in the northeast and in South India wherein We have farming. So like in Kerala, we have paddy farms which are basically lower than the sea level. So the sea level is much higher, but then you kind of embank those areas and allow for flooding to happen. And so the paddy is essentially grown in that inundated land. So you don't have to pump up water. When it rains, you collect the water in there and then you sow the seeds. And and in the summer season, the water dries up and the plants kind of come on. So we knew ways of adapting with nature. But with the industrial revolution, everything changed. The whole equation kind of changed, and cities started getting worse and worse. And so this is. Can anyone tell me which city is this? Guys, you'll have to unmute and then speak.
Uh,
Anyone? I
New
mean, I'm
York,
not looking at your names right now.
New York.
New York.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
it's
that's Central Park in the center, I guess.
Yeah.
yeah, it's the Manhattan Island of New York. And can you all see my cursor? Can you see my cursor move?
No.
No.
No. Okay, so then I don't know how to kind of show you the Central Park, but it's that rectangular, that rectangular swatch like a band-aid, which is there in the center of this linear island. That one is the Central Park. So now why am I mentioning Central Park and why am I not looking at examples anywhere else? Because New York or Manhattan Island, like, it was like any other city of that time, was a city of class differences. So you had the rich, the clergy who were there, and then you had the workers who were on the other end of it. And the favorite pastime then used to be, you know, one would actually take a horse carriage, one would go to the countryside, and one would spend a few days out there. And because cities were heavily polluted, and so in order to kind of regain your health and kind of be be in tune with one's health, the rich would actually go to the countryside, live there for a few weeks or a few days, and then come back. So the idea of having a holiday home and and all of it essentially comes from there. But what about the poor people? What about the working class? They did not have the means to actually enjoy a countryside. So, what the authorities actually did, and what this great visionary, his name was Frederick Law Olmsted, what he did was, he kind of proposed this idea, and actually, I may present this all with a sense of nobility to this, but then there were also all other reasons, which were involved in it. Like, for example, that land was not very amenable, and that land had people of a certain class who were living there, who they had to kind of rehabilitate to kind of get this park set up. So there were all sorts of these other stories also which are there, but right now we're only concentrating at of how the profession of landscape architecture kind of came about. So what I would urge you to do is actually start reading about these, and and kind of understand the other narratives which are there along with it. I mean, if I start talking about them, then the whole class would just go in just one park design. Or maybe any of you who are interested in knowing more about it can actually ask me. I can give you the links, and you can kind of start looking at those readings as well. Okay, so Frederick Law Olmsted, what he did was he suggested having this fallow land in the center, which was marshy and had a lot of rocks, and so one couldn't lay out the grid of the city in there without having to blast all those rocks. He said, why don't we create a park? And there was a competition that was kind of set forth, and Frederick Law Olmsted, along with a partner whose name I forget right now, they designed this 800 or so odd acres of a park. Now, imagine at that time, they had designed this park as a large, piece of landscape within the city to mimic the natural countryside. So that was the intention. So it had large lawns, it had large water bodies. So there were existing marshes which were then dredged and made into large lakes. They planted a lot of trees. So it's said that there are written records, wherein there was a concept in which they said that there would be a time that would come when Manhattan would have buildings which are extremely tall, and and then one had to have trees which would kind of hide those buildings. So, and because this park you know took so much of an area in a city, what would happen? Like on the peripheral road, there would be a lot of traffic, right? There are all these roads which are kind of coming in and kind of adding into that peripheral road. So what they did was, imagine this is 150 years back. So what they did was they essentially have four connections within the park. You can't really see it in the photograph, but they have four subterranean connections. So the road, so I mean east-west connections. So the road kind of dips down into the park, goes under the vegetation, and then it kind of goes up and connects to the other end. They were not tunnels exactly. So within the park, there would be bridges that would kind of connect. They were kind of open tunnels. I mean, I don't know what to call them. They were just gashes in the landscape, and they would plant it with trees so that when you're inside the park, you don't even know that there is a road that's going down, unless when you're crossing the bridge and when you look down and you see, oh, there is a road. So, like in this particular drawing, I'm not sure if you can see it from the left. If you look at it, six, seven, the seventh vertical road that is there in the plan. That particular road is a connection. Then you again have another connection here. So you have a few connections in the in that park. So there was a fair enough idea that the pedestrians had to be kept away from vehicles, and also the way the circulation of the park is designed. There were bridle trails. Bridle trails are trails which are meant for horse driven carriages. Bridle, BRIDLE, bridle trails. So those were separate. Pedestrian footpaths were separate. So the concept of pedestrian vehicular segregation that we speak about today in our cities and in Indian cities, we still don't have it in many places. At least Mumbai is actually a very fortunate city to have footpaths. If you go around and see many other cities don't even have footpaths. Pedestrians share their street spaces with roads. So, and we are still warming up to the idea of having the segregations in place. So, I mean, it was already there in that time, and Frederick Law Olmsted was actually responsible for coining the term landscape architecture. Or he is essentially. It's not that there weren't designers in the past who weren't designing spaces which were outside a building, but they would be called a gardener, or they would be called just a designer. So this is how the profession kind of came about, and this is also how, for the first time in the world, you have a public space that has been designed for the public. So in Europe or in India, one would actually have these large gardens which were designed. So the Mughals had, gardens which were probably older than uh, the Central Park. In Europe, you had the Hyde Park, and you have all these, large gardens which were there, or the Kensington Gardens and all of them. But what is important to note that those parks or those gardens were meant for the rich or the clergy. It was never meant for the public or the people to kind of come in. So here is an example wherein it was designed for the people in the first case, and then this wasn't replicated in many other cities. So here is an image of how the park was in the past and how is it today. So you can actually see how the grain of the buildings, the tall buildings around, how they've changed. So the buildings along the park edge were always, high end, and so they actually were, taller, and they were one of the first buildings to kind of come up. While you see, empty plots in the background on the image on the right, while on the left you have an image which is like 10 years old. And also at the turn of the century. So I spoke about cities. So cities had a lot of problems. They were reeling in pandemics. They were reeling in hygiene issues. There was very high city pollution. People were having issues with their breathing. So respiratory diseases were very common. So one had to make sanatoriums in places which were far away from the city, wherein one could breathe fresh air and be in nature and then kind of recuperate. So like a lot of our hill stations today, where in the past or had in the past, tuberculosis sanatoriums. So that was the place where people who had tuberculosis or people who had respiratory diseases were basically sent to, and they would just be in nature and kind of heal themselves out, because there was no the antibiotics were still not discovered at that time. Yeah. So in that period, there was another visionary whose name was Ebenezer Howard, who kind of came up with a completely new, idea of a city. What he called as a garden city. So his idea was that garden cities were self-contained cities. So they were far away from the existing cities, but then there were self-contained cities, which basically had a town, a town center, a city center, and it had the agricultural fields which were all around it. And once that self-contained city gets filled with people, then you don't just keep going and expanding that city, but what you do is you make another city somewhere else. And then there would be a network of connections between these cities. So, and in many ways, his idea, so garden cities were built, but they were not built. So he had a horseshoe diagram that you see on the right. Garden cities were never built as a horseshoe diagram, but the idea or the gist of the idea was taken, and many cities were basically based on it. So even the central core of New Delhi, so this garden city movement was essentially in the late 1890s, 1898, if I'm right. That was his book when he published it. And then New Delhi was designed in 1912 or 19, in the in the second decade of 1900s. So yeah, so New Delhi was actually inspired by the Garden City. So if you look at the historic core, wherein you have the central vista and all those areas and the pathways that kind of radiate out and the tree-filled streets, and the fact that there are open spaces, which are within the city and all of it. So garden cities were designed as small satellite towns for major cities in Europe as well. So the first garden city was Welwyn and Letchworth. But they're still garden cities now, but it was never a successful concept. But what's important to note is that the fact that garden cities essentially gave importance to human health. So cities were no more about just adapting spaces and putting in buildings, but it was more about human health. It was more about how does one coexist with nature? How does one kind of, look at resources? So all these important concepts then stuck around. So a lot of other cities and a lot of other city movements that came later on were actually inspired by the garden city. And then we have many other theorists. So I'm only talking about Kevin Lynch. I don't know if you guys know about Kevin Lynch, but he came up with this concept of imageability. So he basically spoke about human perception of urban form and how should cities be designed, or how are cities already being perceived by humans, and how do you define cities? So how does identity, legibility, coherence of urban form kind of work? So on one side we're talking about human nature relationships, even though humans are a part of nature, and we're looking at ecology and the environment and how humans work. On the other end, it's also important to understand how do we perceive things, how are cities kind of designed. So this is something that you intuitively do in your design processes, but something that you may not be really aware of. So imageability, like the way Kevin Lynch actually kind of defined, was a quality of a physical object that gives it a high probability of invoking a stronger image in any given observer. So in a city, he said that there are 5 different entities that one could possibly look at. So one was a landmark. So a landmark is an entity that basically has a character of its own. Something that we kind of define it with. Like for example, in later cities, or even in the existing cities, like let's say Flora Fountain, for example. Flora Fountain is a landmark in the city, and it's a marker. We know that okay, there is this particular landmark, and then we have to take a right from this particular place. A building could be a landmark. Like for example, um, like you're getting down at Dadar and you have to go to some place, then one could say, oh, that tall glass tower building, which is there. वहां से आप left लीजिए, आपको वो दिख जाएगा building right में, and then you keep walking to that side. So a building could be a landmark. A landscape could be a landmark. A huge tree could be a landmark. And then you have districts. Districts are essentially these patches of homogeneous, or or of mixed land use which are there. Like for example, Juhu. So when I say district, you don't mean district like Satara or or Belgaum, वैसा नहीं, but districts within a city. Like for example, Juhu. JVPD could be considered as a district. So you have these. So JVPD as opposed to let's say the rest of Andheri. Or the Juhu Tara Road wala edge as opposed to JVPD. So there are these different districts which are there within a city. Then you have nodes. So places where people congregate and people kind of diverge. So there are nodes which are there, and then there are edges. So the way the buildings basically behave with the foreground. So I mean, if you look at JVPD, if you look at our college and the surroundings, or if you look at the places which are near your homes, you would actually find spaces to kind of a mental image to kind of put for all of these. And then you have paths. So the and you actually experience a city. So what Kevin then said was that you actually experience a city through these five lenses, or your experience of a city can actually be explained through these five lenses. That's what he meant. I mean, the theory is far more complex, but I'm actually simplifying it because I understand that you're in your third year and you're kind of being exposed to all this for the first time. And in 1969, so you have Ian McHugh, who kind of came up with his his theory of how landscape architecture is not just about creating landmarks and creating beautiful plazas, or planting a few trees and making a healthier landscape, but it's also about responding to the environment or the ecology. So what he came up was that his understanding of nature was fairly scientific. And he was responsible for setting up a landscape department in the University of Pennsylvania in the US, even though he was from Ireland and he grew up in rural Ireland. And he was a keen observer of nature. So what he set up is something that we follow even now. All big architects, all big planners, all big urban designers. Even this whole technology of GIS. If you heard of GIS, GIS is a technology called Geographic Information Systems. Even the basis for that technology essentially comes from the study that Ian McHugh had kind of put together. Now, what exactly is the study? So what Ian McHugh said was that before you intervene in a particular land, like for example, you went to Almora last year. So ideally, even before you start thinking of building in Almora, you need to understand the process. I spoke about this in the last class. Like some of you who may remember what we spoke about in the last class would know that we spoke about the different abiotic and biotic factors of the earth, right? Different non-living and living things. I do remember very clearly that we've had a few mention. So we had a few classes where we mentioned this in the first year as well when we did your EVS module, right? So we have non-living and living things. We have soil, we have earth, we have plants, we have animals, and all of these systems are constantly interacting. And what happens when we go there, we kind of clear it and we place our building. The relationships change. So is there a possibility in which we can actually place our building which responds to all of these? So of course there'll be some changes. We can't really help it. We have to obliterate landscapes, or landform, or we have to cut trees. We may have to push away fauna from that place. But then there are ways in which we can do it with a very little ecological damage. So that way, but then how do you do that? So what McHugh basically did was he came up with a process which is known as the layer cake analysis. So what he would do is he would differentiate the different entities of the earth and he would document them separately. So like for example, topography or landform, he would have a layer or a glass plate wherein he would mark the contours of your site, and he would then kind of analyze which all areas have a steep slope, which all areas have a gentle slope. So landform or topography is documented on a layer. So that's why it's called the layer cake analysis. A layer cake is basically a cake which has different layers, right? You cut it and you can see these different layers which are there. So in the same way, he would have a glass plate. Now I'll tell you why a glass plate and not a drawing. So a glass plate which has this. And then he would have another glass plate in which he would document the different soils which are present in that area. The different kind of bedrock, like are there places which have a deep rock? Are there places which do not have a rock? So I'm talking about large scale sites, not like a small site like what you would have probably intervened at Almora. So, but you need to be aware of it because soon you will be doing urban design and you will be designing larger buildings. So, the geology or the soils are kind of documented. They're overlapped. Then you have another overlay which would have all the trees which are marked, and not just the trees in terms of its girth and its crown, but also an understanding of which all trees are evergreen, which all trees are deciduous, which all trees are beneficial, like they have an ecological role to play, which all trees are invasive, like what are they? So you kind of overlay all of these, and what he would do is he would kind of light a lamp below. It's like a topo table that you have, so and then he would compare these things, he would analyze them, and then he would come up with zones which are areas which need to be preserved or protected, areas which could possibly be used for development. We can build those areas easily, areas which are actually degraded, so we need to enhance those areas. So essentially you would know what is known as a suitability analysis. You can understand which all areas can be built, which all areas should not be built. A very scientific way of actually approaching design of land, rather than just blatantly just covering the whole earth with a grid of streets and buildings. This was in the 1960s. And what are we doing in the 2020s? Are we still following it? Unfortunately, no. Many people are doing it. Many organizations are doing it. Many educational departments have actually started adopting the way of ecological site planning as a integrated part of design. But unfortunately for us, the way that architectural education is seen in our country, our understandings of architecture are fairly devoid of the environment, even though there is an environmental emergency which is there. So which is why it's important for us to kind of look at it at least through allied design, at least through environmental EVS, environmental studies subject, and whenever you get an opportunity, try and explore more and try and incorporate these things into your design. Now, this is a great diagram. This is a diagram which we spoke about last class as well. Remember, I spoke about the natural entities and the anthropogenic entities. Some of you asked me what exactly does anthropogenic mean. So this is the same diagram. I'm kind of harping it. I'm kind of showing it again and again in all these classes so that it kind of stays back in your mind. So like a layer cake, we start from the bottom. How do you bake a cake? You do the base layer first, and then you overlay the rest of the layers, right? So in the same way, like let's start from the bottom, So you have climate. So in climate, you basically need to have an understanding of the macro climate. Macro climate meaning the larger climatic conditions of an area. Then you need to know the microclimate. You know what macroclimate and microclimate are. We did this in the EVS lectures. Then you need to understand the geology of a place. So, which basically means the superficial geology, which means, what are the kind of soils which are there? Are there rocky outcrops in your site? And you also need to know the bedrock. Now, this is not just for landscape. This is for architecture. This is for planning. This is for everything. Because unless you know the soil bearing capacity of that place, how would you know whether, whether is it even suitable for you to design a 4-floor high building, or whether it's what kind of foundation would you need? So, and this is something that we do for all projects, but then unfortunately, it's only done in from a structural perspective. It's never done in from the perspective of ecology or of environment. So you understand geology. On top of it, then we understand, what are the elevations or the slopes. What is elevation? I think I spoke to you about this last class as well. Elevation doesn't mean elevation of a building, but elevation basically means heights. Like in an atlas, you have different elevational mapping, so different heights. So you need to know which are the high areas, which are the low areas, how does water flow in your site, then how does the slopes, how do the slopes work, are they steep slopes, are they gentle slopes, would you need a lot of cut and fill in your project, or can you kind of minimize cut and fill and still have a beautiful building that responds to your site? Then you need to understand the hydrology of that place, the surface water, when it rains, how does the water flow through, and the groundwater. So the reason why I harp on it is also because there's a very interesting example that I tell my students usually. Like there was a project that I was a part of, wherein we designed a swimming pool, for a project, and one day we get a call, like a frantic call, that like the swimming pool is cracked, and it was in the midst of the rains, and we were like, the swimming pool is cracked. I mean, like how can a swimming pool crack? And so they said, no, you have to come to site, you have to come and see this. So this was in an area where there was black cotton soil. A large area of Maharashtra actually has black cotton soil. So it's the reason why we need to understand soils and we need to understand water. So we said, but as a landscape architect, how can we help it? Because it's a structural drawing that they used to create the swimming pool. But of course, the design was ours, but then the structural thickness and all of that was structures. So there was a huge tussle between, no, we never told you, how much of saria to put in, how much of concrete to put in. We only gave you the basic drawing, and the design of it, and the rest of it looks fine. So how a landscape architect is responsible for this? But still, we went there as responsible consultants. We still went there with the structure, with the architecture, instructional consultant, architecture, and the client, and we went to the site. And to our amazement, we see that the entire pool has cracked like a wafer. It's like a Kit Kat. It's like there's a crack right there. And we were amazed. And the structural consultant couldn't explain what it was, and the architect couldn't understand. There was a wise man in the neighborhood who actually helped us out and who said, "Oh, you know why? Because this is an area which has black cotton soil, and black cotton soil has an ability of contracting and swelling when it rains. So it contracts during the summers and it gets cracked. But when it rains, the soil expands. So the architect then suddenly realized, oh yeah, like that is why our building footing is designed like a raft. And there's a reason why we had done that, and that's because it's black cotton soil, because that's what works in the vicinity. And as landscape architects from Delhi, we had absolutely no idea about this. And so we asked a structural consultant, but were you the same consultant who designed the footing for the architecture? What happened to the landscape? So, like with everything in landscape, the structural consultant probably hadn't given heed to it. So then we had to redesign the whole area. And so then we actually questioned, do you really need such a large swimming pool? It's a small family home. Can we then do a more sustainable, way in which they needed a water body? They needed a water body which one could actually go in and experience water. So then maybe a smaller plunge pool would have been much better rather than a swimming pool. So, it was a learning experience for us. But then what is important is that what we learn in school and what we forget. So it's not that all landscape architects go through this, Ian McHagan way of layer cake analysis, but then when you start practicing, many of these things are kind of ignored. So it's the reason I'm harping on this is because it's important for you to, before you start designing a building, understand the soils. Many offices don't do it. In reality, many practices don't do it. So even though, because you are going to graduate out in 2 years, you're going to start your own practice soon. So have this sensitivity, have this understanding. And then you need to know the vegetation. You need to understand the wildlife. What kind of animals, what kind of birds are there, and then you respond the way. So you may ask me, Sandeep, how is it possible that even within a city, how can you actually plan for birds? It's definitely possible. So one of these lectures, so maybe in the next class or so, maybe what I'll do is I'll do a supplementary quick lecture wherein I can show you research of how to design buildings wherein you can actually maximize, local birds. What kind of buildings or what kind of landscapes actually encourage birds to come in, and what kind of landscapes actually repel them. So there was a very interesting project that I did in 2010, wherein the client, it was a house garden. And I wasn't very kicked about it because I was like, so many projects and just one more project. And then suddenly, I meet this lady of the house, and a very old lady, who tells me that, Sandeep, I'm not looking for a beautiful garden, but I'm looking for a garden wherein I want my friends to actually come in the evening and just feel it's their garden. So I said, great. She asked me, do you want to meet my friends? I said, yes, of course. Like if it's a part of the design process, then I would actually love to come and meet them. So she said, come to my present home where I'm living at 6:30 in the evening. I went there at 6:30 in the evening, and to my amazement, I see there are no human beings out there. I ring the bell, and she calls me in, and she says, "Oh yeah, come, let's sit in the garden." We sat in the garden, and there were like around 100 sparrows and mynas, and the other the shavs. There were so many birds in that garden, and trust me, on the road I could find no bird out there. Even though I could hear them chirp and kind of move because it was twilight and all the birds were kind of moving to the nest. But one urban garden in the middle of Delhi, and it was not a large space. It was probably, if you can imagine, 6 meters by 8 meters. So 6 meters in width and 8 meters in length, and that was it. That was the urban space that was there, but heavily planted with plants all around. And it was not even a beautiful garden to look at. I mean, it was like a dark space, in there to kind of get in. But you sit there and you find like 100 birds chirping all around, kind of getting into the trees and There was a bird bath, and there was a small area for grains, and it was an experience that kind of transformed the way that then I started looking at gardens post that. And so we designed her new garden that was in Gurgaon, which is like in the outskirts of the city. And we designed it with the principal. So because she, even though she was not an ecologist, but she has lived with birds for so many years. So I learned quite a lot from her. And I think we can do one lecture in which I can actually tell you about all these things. And it's an amazing experience, and it's a very satisfying experience at the end of the day, that it's not the project fees or the beautiful photographs that you click of the project and you upload them on a website. That's not what's important. But what's important is that you design something which is beyond the project brief. It's not just for the humans, but it also benefits the larger ecology. That's amazing. And then comes all these human related layers, like the anthropogenic layers that I spoke about last class, of land use, of the population demographics, of the community organizations. Where exactly are the bus stops placed? How is the infrastructure outside? The economics of it. Then in a site, do you then build an office complex or a housing complex? Like all these decisions are actually interweaved into the way in which you intervene a building. So they are not separate decisions which are taken by MBAs and a project development, business development team sitting somewhere else, but it's all a integrated program altogether. So this essentially is how McHagan analysis is done. But how is it done is something that we may kind of look at a later date. But I just want you to understand these different layers. You may know about them, you may have heard of them in different parts, but I just want to kind of put them all together for you in one place. And this layer cake analysis, which used to be done with glass plates and with a topo table, light below, is something that architectural and landscape architecture offices later used to do on tracings. So you have tracing sheets wherein you trace these and then you kind of color them with different intensities. So something that's more valuable is colored really dark. Something which is not so important is colored in a medium tone, in a lighter tone with hatches. And then when you overlay these and then when you light it up or see it, whichever are the darker patches are the ones that kind of give you hints. So, and there is a way in which you kind of give valuation also to all of this. You kind of evaluate. So your evaluation may be different from your friend's evaluation for the same site. So which is why your sensitivity also plays a large role in in how this layer cake analysis actually works. What GIS does is exactly this. GIS is a technology which kind of allows us to have these maps which are already pre-fed into the data, or you can feed more data into it. And GIS allows us to create different layers, switch them on, switch them off, overlay them, analyze them, run in some queries. It will give you the answers. So it'll basically minimize our time that we need to do this, because otherwise imagine your back would break while you start drawing these maps, tracing them out like 10 times, and then you overlay them, and then you make a different set of maps where you compare them, and then again you trace them, and then you kind of look at it. So nowadays we have technology, but the concept kind of remains the same. Okay, so with that, I'm going to kind of end the lecture, the first part of the lecture, and the second part of the lecture, I'll show you a landscape project. Okay, so before I go there, we can take questions. So in order to keep the lecture crisp for whoever who needs to look at it at a later date and understand it, I'll end the recording and then I'll start taking the questions. If you want, we can record the questions separately as a different.